on, I was able to find a lot of the people that worked in the WWF front office in the mid 80s that had never spoken publicly about that period. And so that was exciting to break some new ground and talk to Jim Troy, for example, who was the senior vice president of Titan Sports from starting in 1982, was kind of Vince McMahon's running buddy and sidekick in those pivotal early years, along with Bob McMullen, who was the first CFO of the company, who knew all this stuff about the behind the scenes financial part about how they were able to expand nationally. That is a fascinating little window of time there where Vincent Kennedy McMahon, Vince McMahon Jr., had bought the company from his dad pretty much in secret in June of 1982 for $1 million. And even after he bought the company, the rest of this is back in the early 80s. There is no internet. There's no way to really get information around. And so no one other than the few people in that room really knew that Vince Jr. had bought the company. But once he bought it, he started thinking, okay, how am I going to build this thing and take it national? And I think in the back of his head, he always knew, having worked with Hulk Hogan during his previous run in the WWF, that this is the guy that he wanted to have as his horse to, carry the company. And so he's got his eyes on Hulk Hogan, who's in the AWA in 1983. And in this book, I was able to get some of this backstory where Vince McMahon hires a photographer and a writer from a newspaper in upstate New York to come in mid-1983 to launch his new WWF-only magazine called Victory Magazine. That may have seemed like a small thing, but it was actually a very big thing strategically, because what he then did is he sent the photographer and who's named Steve Taylor and the editor, the writer, Ed Holinsky, and he would send them to different territories like the AWA and say, hey, we're going to run a story in our magazine about you. Can we send our writer and our photographer? When they would get there, they would have Vince's business card with them, which they would secretly hand to the wrestlers, asking them to get in touch with Vince. So Vince had a way of secretly poaching the talent from other territories. And they did this with Hulk Hogan. And so, Hulk Hogan is very secretly and quiet being recruited by Vince McMahon in late 1983. Meanwhile, Iron Sheik had been wrestling in Georgia, and he gets a call to come back to New York, where he had been previously. He doesn't know he's going to win the championship, but I think he has a strong suspicion he's going to get a push. We know that Bob Backlund wasn't thrilled with the idea of Hulk Hogan being the champion, but he was okay with Iron Sheik because he respected him and had wrestled him in the AWA in 1977 and really respected his amateur wrestling credentials. And so the night of the show, Backlund was aware in advance that he was going to lose the belt because he had come up with the finish to have Arnold Skolin throw in the towel. Iron Sheik said he wasn't aware for sure until they got to the building that night, and Vince McMahon Sr., Vincent J. McMahon, took them into the bathroom and said, okay, here's how it's going to go down. So the intrigue. And then, the month later, Vern Gagne offers Sheik $100,000 to break Hogan's leg and take the belt to the AWA, and all of that happened. So it's just a fascinating, 3-month period in wrestling history.
So were they still kayfabing it that Vince McMahon Jr. had bought the company to the boys at that point, or was there some type of meeting and announcement about that?
Yeah, they were still, when I got Bill Eadie's testimony from his lawsuit against Vince when he sued him in 1991, and he does this long deposition where they're interviewing him about his run as the Masked Superstar in 1983-84, and Bill basically is saying under oath that, yeah, Vince, Vince Jr. was just the announcer, and we just thought of him as the announcer and the boss's son, but not the boss. And to the point where at one point Vince Jr. wanted him to take off his mask, and Bill Eadie didn't want to. And so Bill had to kind of go to Vince Sr. and have him pull rank. And it's all this fascinating, again, sort of new information that has come out from this research, because that story only exists in this deposition, which only exists in hard copy in a storage facility in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
They always say Vince Sr. never would have sold to Vince Jr. had he known Vince Jr.'s expansion plans. In your research, could you confirm that at all?
Not directly, because I didn't get to, Vince wouldn't, not surprisingly, wouldn't talk to me. And I think he's one of the only people still alive that might really know the answer to that. Like Jim Barnett has passed away. He was in the front office. People like Gorilla Monsoon, they might know, but they're all gone. Linda McMahon would know, but she wouldn't talk to me. So my suspicion based on circumstantial evidence is that he would not have approved of all the things that Vince did, but that he would have been okay with Vince, overall Vince's effort to go national, because I think it was in 1983, the WWF seceded from the NWA. And basically when Vince Jr. was getting pushback, Vince Sr., although reluctant, still said, okay, let's go off and let's do this.
What was the company's structure like around that time, as far as, I guess Vince owned it, so he would have been at the top? Would his father have been an advisor? You mentioned
What?
Gorilla Monsoon.
Yeah, I don't know. So in 1979, Vince incorporates Titan Sports, but he doesn't buy the company. He does that with Linda. They, for a few years, ran the Cape Cod Coliseum. That was their main job. And so I talked a lot in the book about how Vince first got on the USA Network and how he used a hockey team in Cape Cod to bring in revenue. I don't know officially what Vince McMahon Sr.'s title was once he sold the company to Vince Jr. But again, Vince Jr. had a year to make the 4 payments totaling $1 million to Vince Sr. So even though Vince Jr. makes the first payment in June of '82, it's still a year before that is complete. Once Vince Jr. has ownership, Linda is basically the executive vice president. Jim Troy is the senior vice president. Jim Barnett is brought in mid-1983 to be some high-level vice president, largely for his connections politically and because he could be instrumental in getting the WWF TV show on different markets where he had been a promoter previously. Joe Perkins was the guy in charge of also the syndication and the TV stuff. Howard Finkel was there. Ed Cohen was the live event booker. And then, there's another handful of employees. But in that when they moved to Greenwich, Connecticut in the fall of '83, the whole company was probably like 20 people. I mean, it was not